So we're going to have a look at what BIOS is, and one of the key things we're going to be looking at is the difference between BIOS and the operating system. They're both system software, however, they perform different roles and are very, very, very different. So we're going to look at how a PC starts up and understand the role that BIOS has and what it actually does. Now, when you first switch on the computer, BIOS is the thing that kicks in straight away. So a number of things will happen. First of all, it will start the post, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Post stands for power on self-test. It will then initialize the CPU and any hardware. It does that during the post as well. And then it will start to load up the operating system. So when we first switch the PC on, it needs something to get started with. Okay, so we need a piece of software immediately to start running. So that piece of software is known as BIOS, and it's located in the computer's ROM, read-only memory. Okay, so we store it there because without any software, as you know from the binomial architecture, it won't actually do anything, because all the CPU will do is run instructions provided by software. So if we don't give it any software, it can't do anything. So we need something to run straight away. So we store it in ROM, read-only memory, because we don't want to change it, we don't want to accidentally delete it, and we want to make sure it's always there. So the first thing the CPU will do is start executing the code that it finds in ROM, and the first part of that code is test. So the power on self-test will detect the hardware that's currently connected to the motherboard. So it's important that the motherboard and the CPU know what's connected to it, so it can actually start to initialize interrupts and all that sort of stuff. So it needs to know what storage devices are. So if there's no storage devices connected to the computer, then there's no place for the operating system to be located, so we would end up failing. If we didn't have a keyboard and mouse where we can control the computer, so that there's no point even continuing. Any USB devices that might need initializing, and obviously the graphics card, because we want to be able to see stuff. So it will detect if that hardware is connected or not, and then initialize them, basically tell them to start setting themselves up. If there's an error during initialization of these devices, or if the device isn't available, then the post will report back saying there's a problem and potentially the system won't boot. So in some circumstances, such as no storage devices or no keyboard and mouse, the computer will just stop. If there's a problem with maybe another device, it might still continue, but that device won't work. So that's kind of the basic idea. Now, it doesn't check to see if these devices are fully working, they just check to see if I can initialize them or not. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if the power on self-test passes, that everything's hunky-dory, because it might not be the case. Now, the next thing that has to happen is the computer needs to start off the operating system. Okay, so once the power on self-test goes, it needs to then load the operating system, which is going to be stored somewhere in secondary storage. Now, that might be on the hard drive, because this is the most common place to find it, but it also might be found on a USB or a DVD drive. If you, for example, were reinstalling Windows, or if you were installing Linux, as an example, you'd most likely plug in a USB with the operating system on, or a DVD with the operating system on, and you want it to boot off that first. So BIOS will go in order, trying each secondary storage device until it finds this thing called a bootloader. So on the secondary storage device, there's a special sector which is located right at the start, known as the boot sector or the bootloader, and that basically has a little bit of information inside, a little bit of code, which says this is where you can find the real operating system. Now, normal order to try devices, secondary storage devices, is the CD drive, DVD drive first, then any USB devices, and then finally the hard drive. Now, we have those removable drives first because normally we'd be booting off the hard drive because we've installed the operating system already. But let's say I want to change the operating system, want to upgrade it, or want to try out Linux, for example, on a live disk. I want it to boot from those first, because if it goes straight to the hard drive, it will never, ever, ever try the other two. So if a DVD is present but has no bootloader, then BIOS just simply moves on to the next level. So even though it is going to check these devices, it doesn't necessarily mean it will try and boot for them, because they have to have this bootloader present. Okay, and you have to manually put it on yourself using a special program, or obviously download a image and put it on DVD which has the bootloader on. So the bootloader will say where the code to start the operating system resides on the secondary storage device, and once the post is complete and the bootloader is found, it will then be able to start executing operating system code. Okay, so that bootloader effectively points the CPU in the right place. Now, that's kind of the overview what BIOS does. So it's effectively a way of checking everything's there and also to start off the operating system. But you can also change the settings of it. Now, it does depend on the computer, but normally if you press one of the F keys, maybe F2 or F12, you'll be able to get into BIOS. And you can change settings. So on the right hand side, I've got little screenshots. On the screenshot, I've got an example of boot priorities. So here I can say which order they can come in. Now, this is a fairly older version of BIOS, because you can see it's got floppy drive there, which we don't particularly use anymore. But hopefully you get the idea. You've got an order of booting devices. We can overclock the CPU, which I strongly don't recommend unless you really know what you're doing and you've got some really good cooling. You can change some of the CPU features. So, for example, some CPUs come with additional features such as virtual machine instructions, or maybe some 3D acceleration or something like that. Motherboard features, so these are motherboard specific features that you can enable or disable. I mean, most times people don't need to go into BIOS. It's only when you have to do something very specific you'd ever go into it. Now, although on the spec it's talking about BIOS, there is an alternative one, which is one you probably are more familiar with, and it's known as UEFI, or Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. This is kind of like the next version of BIOS, and it boots a lot faster. Okay, so a computer with UEFI is going to boot significantly faster than one with normal BIOS. It has a number of different features other than speed, one of which is security. So we can do something called a secure boot, where the operating system has to be signed specifically using a digital signature, otherwise the computer just will ignore it. If you want to see a little bit of difference between BIOS and UEFI, I've included a link at the bottom so you can actually get a little bit more of wider reading and some ideas. Now, UEFI is not on the spec, however, I think it's important to be familiar with it, because the screenshot on the right is probably what you're more used to if you've got a modern-ish computer. So, notes task, describe the purpose of BIOS in the post, describe what the bootloader is and the boot order, and explain why BIOS is stored in ROM and the OS is stored in secondary storage. That last question I think is really important. It's the kind of questions I might ask about it. So why do we store BIOS in ROM, and why is the operating system stored in secondary storage? Some ideas might be that the BIOS can't be changed, it has to always be there. So if it's not there, the computer will just freeze, it won't do anything. So it's crucially important that it's not accidentally deleted or overwritten or anything like that. And the operating system itself will have lots of updates, we might change it, we might want to swap from Windows to Linux, so we want that flexibility and the ability to upgrade it whenever we want to. Subject clarification. Candidates need to understand the role of the BIOS in a computer system, the steps that BIOS goes through to start up the computer. And that's essentially the idea of post and the idea of the bootloader.